My name is Brett McCracken. I am an editor, senior editor at the Gospel Coalition. I work full-time. I focus on arts and culture, but I'll do a number of other things as well. And just happy to be here, happy to be able to interview some of my favorite authors. So right now I'm going to talk to Alan Noble. Alan Noble is one of the brightest minds, thinkers, writers in evangelical culture right now, I would say. His new book, Disruptive Witness. Alan, I think you know I'm a huge fan of this book. I think I said on Twitter it was the most important Christian book of 2018. So if you have not read Disruptive Witness, please get it. And we're going to talk a bit about it today. But just to kind of introduce you, Alan, you are a professor of English at Oklahoma Baptist University. You've written for a number of websites, The Atlantic, Christ and Pop Culture. I think you co-founded that. You are part of the AND campaign. You're involved with that. So you're a really good, balanced thinker when it comes to Christians and politics, which I've always loved about you. And you're leading a breakout session here this afternoon, I think. So that's why you're here at the conference. But let's talk a little bit about this book, Disruptive Witness. I just want to read a little bit from it just to kind of get us going. So in the beginning of the book, you talk about how Christians have adapted and used technology. We've kind of been good at being early adopters of technology, using podcasts, things like what we're doing now, live streams, apps, Bible apps, etc. But you talk about just some unintended consequences of that. So I just want to read a little bit of this from your book. You say, the church is often tempted to look at popular communication in culture and mimic it with a Christian message. And while mimicking the methods of communication in wider culture can sometimes be valuable, it can also unintentionally signal to readers that Christianity is just like all those other ideas. Rather than the disruptive force of revelation that the gospel truly is, our witness makes it just another personal preference, like our favorite bands, pet peeves, political parties, and shopping organic. The challenge for Christians in our time is to speak of the gospel in a way that unsettles listeners, that conveys the transcendence of God and provokes contemplation and reflection and reveals the stark givenness of reality. So, Alan, talk a bit about just the idea of this book and this concept that in our kind of flattened media environment where the transcendent and the trivial are all together coming at us in our feeds. We'll watch a cat video and then like a John Piper sermon in the same feed, and we'll read our Bible verse on our ESV Bible app, on 1 minute, and then we'll be like watching some YouTube video the next. So what are the downsides of that? What does that do to how we conceive of faith in this age?
Yeah, so I like to think of, I think Facebook streams, timelines can be really helpful as an example of this. And you can imagine that, if you get on Facebook, you'll see someone very passionately talking about a basketball team, and then very passionately talking about a political candidate, and then very passionately, sharing a Christian meme. And it does have this flattening effect where everything becomes a couple of things. One, it becomes an option. It's a choice that all of us have availability. But the other thing is that it tends to be a signal of our identity, right? So me sharing that I love, a certain basketball team is me really telling the world, this is who I am, this is my identity, this is how you should think of me. And it's very easy, I think, for Christians to fall into this about their own faith. And so, sharing a scripture, if, my grandma shares a scripture or meme, right? Maybe it's her sharing something that she read in the Bible that she cares about, but it also could be her way of telling all her friends on Facebook, hey, I'm a Christian, right? And that's not really persuasive to them, right? It's not going to move them to read the Bible, but what it might do is tell them about my grandma. Yeah. My grandma has passed away, so I can, she's not doing this. Yeah. So I don't feel bad.
You have a great chapter on disruptive church practices. How can churches be, modeling this disruptive witness that you talk about? And you open the chapter saying the church can either define its witness by its worship, aesthetics, and rites, or capitulate to secular conceptions of faith as a personal preference. So maybe you could talk about what are some of the ways churches do kind of capitulate to that unintentionally? How do churches kind of model secularism inadvertently?
Yeah. Every time you read a passage, I'm like, I agree with that. I don't know who wrote that, but
who wrote that? Yeah,
I agree. I don't remember writing that, but that's probably true. I think about the way churches promote and draw people in. So one of the ways that churches will often do this is that they'll say, come here, lives will be changed, right? Your family will be closer. And the appeal is church will make your life better. Yeah. Now, I believe in a deep spiritual sense that is true. But as we also know, believing the faith and being faithful to it often involves a lot of suffering. It involves a lot of dying to self. And so one of the ways we capitulate is we use this very similar language that, a fitness club would say, hey, come here, we're going to change your life. You're going to get your life together.
You want wellness in your life?
That's right, wellness, yeah. Or, a counseling or a leadership conference or whatever it might be. And so what I think when people hear that, they think, oh, okay, cool. So that church is just another option I have to make my life better. Maybe I'll try it out, but I have other options. I'll just start this diet plan, and it also promises the same exact things.
Yeah, so on a personal level, you talk about personal habits as well. How can we, as individual Christians, live in a way that's disruptive rather than just kind of reinforcing this idea that Christianity is just one of many options for your kind of best life now, like this path of spiritual health. How can we as Christians in this age live in a way that is disruptive, that unsettles non-believers, that makes them pause and kind of take notice? What are some things that you write about that you would recommend?
Yeah, so I think there are lots of, this was the challenging part about this book, is I think the implications are almost endless. There are lots of ways that you can approach this, and so I just ended up having to land on a few. So it can be, one thing I think that I talk about in the book is just saying grace. We are uncomfortable about saying grace in public because we live in a secular society, and we'd like to, in general, society would say, keep that in your head. Don't talk to us about this. We don't want to hear it. It makes us uncomfortable. And in fact, I think often I myself feel this. I want to get the prayer done between when the server comes to the table and when he or she leaves to go get the salt or whatever, right? And I'm like, okay, quick, guys, we got to pray.
Right.
We don't want to
sees us.
I don't want a waiter hovering and waiting. So
awkward, yeah.
But the trick here is not just to pray in public so that other people can see you. That's not helpful either. But I do think that the very concept of recognizing that God is providing for you, that the food that you have on your table, even though you earn the money to buy it, that God is, and this is a biblical truth, God is preserving you through his gifts. And it's difficult to us. I've been saying that God's grace, God's provision is often hidden through the supply chain, because it's grown here, it's moved here, it's processed here, and then it's given to us, and we pay for it. And it's hard to recognize, oh wow, I only have this because God provided the rain and the sun and the seasons and all these things. Right. So I think one thing to do is saying grace, and saying it in such a way that we focus on acknowledging the reality that God literally provided this food for us. It's not just a formality. This is a fact about reality. And that is disruptive, right? Because we want our American consumer assumption is, I earned this money. Right. I chose this restaurant. I paid for this.
Right. I don't need to say thanks.
I don't need to say thanks, except to myself.
It occurs to me that part of it is also just the disruptive nature of slowing down enough in a culture that is just like so breakneck, so fast. Like we're just running from thing to thing, from tweet to tweet. Like the pace of social media is so relentless. So talk about like the practices of a more contemplative, kind of slow Christian, reflective posture towards the world, and how that can be a disruptive witness.
Yeah, so this troubles me because I think it's possible for each of us individually to make choices to say, well, I'm going to make sure I have time in my life where I'm not doing anything except praying or
Right.
just. So for me, taking walks is really helpful. And I think that can be great. But here's where I worry. I worry that if the rest of our society is structured so that we don't have culturally, we don't make space for contemplation and for thinking, then we're still not doing a good enough job. So, for example, it's increasingly the norm that people have to take their work home with them, that you have to stay available to email, to text, whatever it is.
Always on call.
Always on call. And that's a structural thing that, okay, so maybe you and I decide, okay, I'm going to have an hour every day where I'm not plugged in and I'm not doing anything, I'm just taking a walk. That's great. But we still have a societal problem that absolutely involves our economy, our politics, the way our cities are structured, all of these things. And I don't think it's enough. I don't think we can choose our way out of these problems individually.
Yeah.
I think that's a very American idea of like,
Yes.
well, if I just do this and I do this and I do this, then my life will be better.
Right.
It'll be improved a little, but we need to talk. It's deeper. It's deeper than that.
I think that gets at the importance of the local church, because we're so prone to looking at everything through individual choices and kind of individual disciplines, that we neglect the important shaping influence of the local church in how that can be countercultural in this iPhone world where everything is about right?
Right.
Everything is tailored to me, curated by me.
Yep.
I can take or leave it. So what does the church do? How does the church kind of press against that individualism in a healthy, shaping, disruptive way?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are some basic things. For example, I encourage churches to say no cell phones during the service. Except for exceptions where there's some pressing issue or something. But have physical Bibles in the pew or ask people to bring them. I mean, it's a small thing, but what you're acknowledging to people is we have to be intentional about the way technology invades our lives. And this is a space where we're saying we don't need those distractions. We need to focus on God, on worship, on each other, not on technology. So it's a small thing. I mean, and I also think that maybe not from the pulpit per se, but in Christian education or Sunday school classes or youth groups or things, these concepts need to be taught, right? We need authority figures in the church saying, here are healthy limits. And here as a community is how we're going to treat each other. These are the norms we're going to have. Because otherwise, for Americans, what we do is we just reflexively adopt technology. Right. It's there, it's interesting, we grab it, and then 20 or 5 years later, we're like, oh, look what this did to my brain. Right. That wasn't great.
Yeah. Speaking of technology, I wanted to ask you about social media specifically because you're pretty active on social media, as am I, as are many of you watching. And I think social media is one of the areas where, sadly, there often isn't much of a difference between how Christians use it, like on Twitter, for example. Twitter is this place where there's so many voices. Yeah. This crazy amount of voices yelling at you, yelling at each other. How can Christians have a disruptive witness on Twitter where we're not just another voice in the noise yelling about whatever we want to yell about?
So I think the low-hanging fruit, and I think the most important thing is not to, just like with the advertising the church, that example, the same thing has to happen with Twitter, where we're not treating our faith as just another thing that we're signaling to everyone around us, right? So if you're using similar language and framing and rhetoric around your politics or your sports preference or talking about your kids as you do your faith, people will assume that these are all sort of equivalent in your life. So that's a sort of basic thing that we can avoid doing that I do think helps. And then the other thing is just being sincere about your faith, choosing. So I don't want us, for example, to shy away from when there's a disaster or an event saying, God help us, right? Like we need. Don't be afraid to say that. Don't be flippant, but don't be afraid to say that too.
Yeah, I think the authenticity piece is good because there is this unspoken code of like the right words and what to say or not to say on Twitter. And yeah, I mean, we just need to be authentically Christ-following people in that space, and not be afraid of being accused of the thoughts and prayers only, approach. But we have to be
Yes.
genuine about that too,
And
not
I think
cliche.
we have to be available. So, like, if you're genuine and you're not being trivial about your faith, what can happen is that people will approach you and they will say, "Okay, I've seen you doing this. Talk to me about this." And then also it provides space for you offline to work with people, and that's where I think the real disruptive witness is going to be happening, not primarily on Twitter, but in churches and communities.
Well, yeah, Alan, it's been great to chat with you about
you.
this book. Again, I really benefited from reading this. I think every pastor, every Christian should read it, because I do think it is a problem in our technological, over-distracted, over-mediated age that we do kind of capitulate to just being one of many voices, one of many consumable commodities in this consumer society. And when we do that, we just reduce something that is altogether different, right? Christianity should be in a category that's so different from whatever you see on Instagram sold to you, whatever you watch on YouTube. Like, we're not just another ad. So this book is a really helpful just reminder of that, and a challenge for us to live differently and more disruptively and more counterculturally.